Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Hello everyone, we are from group 3. In this video, we would like to explain a material about sending and receiving information. Happy watching! First of all, let me introduce our group member. The first one is Diananda Riksan. The second one is Nurul Izzah. The third one is Nurul Hamidah. And then me, Nida Nur Fauzia. And the last is Wulan Febrianti. There are 7 subtopics in this material. The first is information in the internal and external communication system. The second is advanced information and the audience's horizon of expectation. The third is the interrelationship of verbal and non-verbal information. And then there are levels of awareness in the dramatic figures of the audience. And the next is the perspective structure of dramatic text. And then epic communication structure in drama. And the last is successiveness and the transmission of information. And now I will explain you guys about information in the internal and external communication system. Generally speaking, the informational value of a single verbal or non-verbal signal changes according to whether it is evaluated within the framework of internal or the external communication system. An illustration of this would be a specific interior design scheme displayed on the stage, since it is essentially a component of the familiar and immediately seen environment for the figures acting within it. It typically provides nothing in the way of information. However, the audience frequently learns something about the traits of the fictitious protagonist, inhibiting it through the barrier of crucial information. The next topic is about advanced information and the audience's horizon of expectation. There are 2 sub-points in this topic. The first is the expectations associated with genre and the title as a form of advanced information. And the second one is thematic advanced information. Now we are talking about the expectation associated with genre and the title as a form of advanced information. This heading already indicates that on the basis of socially received knowledge and experience and a certain familiarity with the convention of dramatic text, the receiver of the dramatic text brings information to the bear on a performance that is inaccessible to the fiction protagonist. This relates to the difference between the fictitious character knowledge of reality and the audience's awareness to the fictionality of what is portrayed, which is the borders and historically least changing level. In addition, many productions of the theater of the absurd frequently play around with the expectation associated with the genre of farce and comedy. For example, the Shakespeare's Miser for Miser, whose title leads one to the expect an Old Testament pattern of value judgment and expectation that is refuted and transcended in the play itself, rather than fulfilled. Therefore, anticipatory information based on audiences' stereotypes and the title interpretation is not all reliable. However, even when it is altered or rejected by the text, it continues to have an impact on how the text is perceived due to its role as a backdrop contrast. The next point is about thematic advanced information. Advanced information of this kind is conveyed in the frequent intertextual references in the dramatic text to the mythical or historical event that the dramatist can safely assume are familiar to his or her intended audiences. Advanced knowledge, whether derived from myth or history, encompasses both the overall backdrop of the storyline as well as the background event. In other words, the audience is aware of both the event that led up to the event that follow the play.
Hello everyone, my name is Nurul Hamida. I will explain you about the interrelationship of verbal and non-verbal information. Let's begin. This chapter is divided into 4 subchapters. First, the matrix of possible relationship. The second is identity. The third is complementary. And the last one is discrepancy. The matrix of possible relationship. In the previous section on the relationship between the advanced information available to the receivers and the transmission of information, it was not deemed necessary to decipher the codes and channel used to transmit that information. This will be the aim of the present section. However, in 2.1.6 above, we briefly discuss the quantitative variability of this relationship. Now, we should like to analyze it more from the point of view of its qualitative and functional variability. The metric of possible relationship. In the simplified model below, we have isolated 3 possible types of basic relationship according to whether the information unit transmitted through the verbal and non-verbal codes and channel are identical to each other, complementary, and discrepant. As you can see in the table, this is the example. There is identity, complementary, and discrepancy. Thus, in a theoretical program such as Wagner notion on the gamma-stuck work, the predominating elements are identity and complementary, whilst in the diametrically opposite theoretical model represented by Bragg-Satria separation of the element, they are complementary and discrepancy. Identity. From the audience point of view, the existence of identity means that in the majority of dramatic texts, familiarity with the primary text is sufficient in itself to ensure a reasonable measure of comprehension. Identity can also be an important aspect too of realist drama. The following extract from Ibsen's Adult House, reproduced without the stage direction, is a clear illustration of this. As you can see in the table, there are Helmus and Nora. The conversation of them is the example of identity. A high percentage of the verbally transmitted information is mediated non-verbally at the same time. The question directed at the dialogue partner, the discovery of the purse, the handing over of the money, the inspection of the Christmas shopping, Helmer's interest in the parcel, and Nora's warding off gesture are all actions that are clearly implied in the dialogue of the primary text. The frequent deictic reference such as here or there and the verbal description of the object have their informational correlative in the physical presence of the set and the properties. Next, the third one, I will explain you about the complementary. Nonverbal information does not just improve repeating or translating information that has already been transmitted verbally. Whether implicit or explicit, it will also always complement. This is from a close and concrete continuum of illusion. From a purely verbal point of view, the question directed toward the dialogue partner in the above extract remain abstract. But with the addition of meme and gesture, they become more individual and are given a particular physical interpretation. For the example of complementary, as you can see in the table, there is the conversation between Barbara and Andresav. You can read it slowly to understand what that means. The last one, I will explain you about discrepancy. By discrepancy, we do not just mean any contradiction that may occur between the character's word and of his or her action, since this can often be understood psychologically and thus be resolved by the receiver. Situation involving disgust or deception, for example, could therefore be interpreted as extreme case of complementary. To illustrate this, we should like to cite 3 short passages from Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, in which this presence occur, 2 of which are in a particular prominent position at the end of the act. You can see in the table, this is the dialogue from Estragon and Valdemar. This discrepancy between the direction implied in the dialogue and the future non-formal behavior can no longer be explained in the purely psychological term as evidence of Estragon's and Valdemar's indecisiveness of the incompatibility of their desires and capabilities. Now we will move to the chapter of level of awareness in the dramatic figures and audience. Let's begin. Okay. In this chapter, there is divided to 5 sub-chapters. The first one is discrepant awareness. The second one is superior audience awareness. The third one is inferior audience awareness. The fourth one is congruent awareness. And the last one is dramatic irony. Okay, let's begin from the first one. Discrepant awareness. The concept of discrepant awareness refers to 2 different relationships. First, there are the difference in the levels of awareness of the various dramatic features, and secondly, there are those between the fictional figure and the audience. Okay, we will move to the second one. The second one is superior audience awareness. In the corpus of existing dramatic texts that stretches from classical antiquity to the present day, the quantitative bias in the discrepant level of awareness has almost always been in favor of the audience rather than the dramatic figure. This is true of both tragedy and comedy. You can see the example in the text. Indeed, the essence of both the tragic and the comics is frequently to be found in the contrast between the superior awareness of the audience and the inferior awareness of the dramatic figure. A few lessons clearly supported in part 48 of this Hamburg dramaturgy. The one is inferior audience awareness. As a dominating factor in the dramatic text, inferior audience awareness is far less common than the reverse. In fact, it doesn't even necessarily predominate in drama that use an analytical technique. In creating pattern of inferior awareness, the texts we have discussed share a common device, namely the reduction in the communicative possibilities open to dramatic figure. The information carrier is left opaque and is only presented in dialogues with figure in front of whom it has to suppress important information. Okay, I will explain you about congruent awareness. In our analysis, the congruent awareness of audience and dramatic figures really represent a borderline case of discrepant awareness in which the element of discrepancy is zero. And such example in Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, which we have already cited on a number of occasions as a manifestation of statistically uncommon dividing structure. What is it that conditions congruent awareness as a predominant pattern in display? First, it is undoubtedly Beckett's special conception of plot and figure. In the future presented, the central figure, Estragon and Vladimir, appear isolated, almost completely divorced from any kind of past that may have existed before the play begins. The dramatic situation is not characterized by the kind of crisis that is demanded by the Aristotelian view of a dynamic dramatic plot, but by the static condition that appears to be without beginning and end, and whose causes are steadfastly ignored in the text. Okay, the last one is dramatic irony, the theory of discrepant awareness from an appropriate backdrop or to an analysis of dramatic irony. The subject of this section in any discussion of irony, though it would be wrong to equate dramatic irony with irony in drama since the latter encompasses an extremely broad spectrum of ironic structure.
Okay, next I will explain about the perspective structure of dramatic texts. Next, I will explain about the perspective structure of dramatic text. 3.5.1 Figure perspective versus the reception perspective intended by the author. The relationship between figure and audience awareness that we analyzed in the previous section is only one particular dimension of the overall context of perspective structure. For the perspective from which a dramatic figure observes the action and the perspectival nuances he gains from it are only partially conditioned by the level of advanced information the figure has had access to. Two additional factors governing figure perspective are psychological disposition and ideological orientation. As an illustration of this, we can take the case of the Antipholus twins from Syracuse and Ephesus in Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors. But figures are equally unaware that the mechanism of mistaken identity is the cause of their experience. Nonetheless, this experience, which uncovers a sense of self-alienation and loss of identity, are perceived differently by the two men. Right from the start, the perspective associated with Antipholus from Syracuse is characterized by melancholy instability and a tendency towards the irrational, whereas the associate with his twin brother from Ephesus is molded by a cholerical temperament. Okay, next I will explain about the perspective structure of dramatic text. 3.5.1 Figure perspective versus the reception perspective intended by the author. To illustrate this, we should like to cite two Shakespeare's plays as example, His Macbeth is particularly rich in dramatic irony, to the extent that the individual incidents of it form an interactive pattern. Macbeth's opening words, "So full and fair a day I have not seen," are a particularly transparent and frequently cited example. The interpretation of these words are intended by Macbeth refers to the contrast between the appalling weather condition and the joy felt after his military victory. At the same time, however, his remark reminds the audience of the witch's word in Act 1, Scene 1. Fair is full and full is fair, which give Macbeth's words an ominous layer of additional meaning of which the speaker himself is unaware. Next, a comic version of this very same structure may be found in the early Shakespearean comedy The Two Gentlemen of Verona, when Julia praises the fidelity of her lover Proteus in the following evasively rhetorical terms. His words are bones, his oaths are oracles. His love sincere, his staff immaculate. His tears pure messengers sent from his heart. His heart as far from proud as heaven from earth. This speech delivered to an audience that has just heard Proteus' long soliloquy in the immediately preceding scene, in which he determines with no less rhetorical effort to be unfaithful to Julia. As in Macbeth, the dramatic irony arises from the discrepancy between the figure's intended meaning and the actual interpretation of it by the audience. This discrepancy is the result of discrepant awareness, which is caused in turn by a particular arrangement of a sequence of scenes. The basic structure are identical. The only difference lies in the emotion that are attached to them. 3.5.1 Figure perspective versus the reception perspective intended by the author. The relationship between figure and audience awareness that we analyzed in the previous section is only one particular dimension of the overall context of perspective structure. For the perspective from which a dramatic figure observes the action and the perspectival nuances he gains from it are only partially conditioned by the level of advanced information that figure has had access to. Two additional factors governing figure perspective are psychological disposition and ideological orientation. The various figure perspective must be regarded as being independent of the author's personal perspective. Thus, the absolute autonomy of a drama with regard to audience and author implies that every verbal U-turns in drama is associated entirely with a particular perspective. As far as the verbal primary text is concerned, the absolute dramatic text is therefore presented as a pattern of contrasting and corresponding figure perspective. On the level of internal communication system, it is polyperspectival. Francis Ferguson has given us an apt description of the pattern of figure perspective in Hamlet. The situation, the moral, and the metaphysical scene of the drama is presented only as one character after another sees or reflects it, and the action of the drama as a whole is presented only as each character in turn actualizes it in his story and according to his highlight. The various figure perspectives are coordinated on equal terms, that is, they possess the same degree of fictional and in principle have the same degree of validity for the receiver. From the outset, all of the figure perspective within the framework or the accepted principle of perspectivae are of equal importance in constituting the authorial intended reception perspective. All of these examples involve a hierarchical pattern of figure perspective, with the perspective of the figure associated with the mediating narrative function, situated above those of the other figures. The former, therefore, has a greater degree of validity since it embraces all of the other figure perspective. However, this doesn't mean that this superordinate figure perspective can be equated with the authorial intended reception perspective. There is a categorical distinction that must be upheld here, too, for the simple reason that it is possible to introduce an epic mediating figure into a drama with the same ironic intention, often associated with the fictional or unreliable narrator in narrative text. Even when there is no irony involved, the superordinate figure perspective still doesn't coincide completely with the authorially intended reception perspective, because the subordinate figure perspective always has some kind of concrete, qualifying, and relativizing effect. This figure is placed above the action and the figures that he reports on, and the parable is presented as if it had been produced by him. This is emphasized by the play within the play structure in order to illustrate the idea he formulates in the exposition, namely that what there is shall belong to those who are good for it. The singular perspective from which he comments on the events portrayed is confirmed rather than undermined by the pattern of subordinate figure perspective. 3.5.3 Techniques used to control and coordinate the perspective. We should now like to determine how the audience in the external communication system is able to recreate the authorially intended reception perspective from the range of individual figure perspective. Or, seen from the production point of view, what channels are used by the author to influence the constitution of this perspective in the receiver. 3.5.3.1 A perspectival information. First, it should be remembered that the transmission of information in dramatic text is not restricted to the verbal primary text alone. It is only a historically variable fraction of the total information transmitted that is mediated to the audience verbally via the perspectival awareness of particular figure. There is a particularly vivid example of this is in A Comedy of Error. In the scene where Adriana describes her husband Antipholus of Ephesus as deformed, crooked, old, and sere, ill-faced, worse-bodied, shapeless everywhere, vicious, ungentle, foolish, blunt, unkind, schematical in making, and worse in mind. 3.5.3.2 The selection of figure perspective. This collection is structured. It is possible to deduce an additional implicit control techniques that can be used in the constitution of the authorially intended reception perspective. Following linguistic analytical practice, we should know, like to examine the structure of this collection of figure perspective according to two criteria: the paradigmatic aspect associated with selection and the syntagmatic aspect associated with combination. The paradigmatic dimension refers to the number and the diversification of the figure perspective that are to be considered in the context of the intended reception perspective. The paradigmatic aspect of selection is also concerned with the degree of emphasis given to each individual figure perspective. Our model has not yet accounted for this. However, absolutely no doubt that in dramatic text, the perspective of a minor figure who perhaps appears no more than once and only has a few lines is considered to be less important than the central protagonist. 3.5.3.3 The combination of figure perspective. The most important implicit control technique is probably the syntagmatic combination and coordination of figure perspective. One aspect of this was analyzed in the above discussion is the of discrepant awareness. The audience of a few of the informational deficiencies in the individual figure perspective enables to collate the contradictory or complementary pieces of information into superior audience awareness. The relationship between figure and audience awareness is thus a part of the relationship between the figure perspective and the intended reception perspective. The structured correlation of the figure perspective guides the audience towards the intended reception perspective. Particularly, transparent models of this kind of implicit evaluative ordering of figure perspective are: first, symmetrical grouping of falsely orientated and diametrically opposed figure perspective around a central figure perspective whose orientation coincides with the intended reception perspective and only needs to be recognized as such by the receiver. 2. The contrasting of a correct figure perspective and a false one, leaving the receiver to choose between them. 3. The contrasting of two opposite and extreme types of falsely oriented figure perspective in such a way as to persuade the audience to choose the golden mean as the intended reception perspective. Of course, the structure of figure perspective in the empirical text is rarely too simple and clear as this schematic model suggests. However, it is generally possible to reduce it to this basic contrasting or corresponding relationship. 3.5.4 Types of perspective structure. An analysis of the relationship between the pattern of figure perspective on the one hand and the authorially intended reception perspective on the other enable us to construct three idealized models for the perspective structure of dramatic text. In doing so, our concern is not to equate different historical manifestations of dramatic form or even individual texts with this idealized abstraction. Rather, they are intended to serve as heuristic aids to help us grasp the historical and typological transformation of the drama. Next is 3.5.4.1 A perspectival structure. The perspectival aspect of every speech in the ideal of absolute drama has given us the tool with which to sketch out the contrasting model of a drama with an perspectival structure. What we mean by this is an extreme form of drama in which the principle of absolute autonomy towards both author and audience, and thus also the separation of the external and internal communication system, is abolished. The result is a text in which the author uses in utterance of the figures to express his own conviction and in which, in turn, the figures serve as mouthpieces for the author by addressing the audience. In terms of verbal communication, the communication model for this kind of text is identical to that for expository text. Example of this were the allegorical morality plays of the late Middle Ages. Their function was similar to the sermon insofar as they were designed to teach the fundamental as yet unquestioned ethical trust and belief. Next is 3.5.4.2 Closed perspective structure. In dramas with a closed perspectival structure, the line of convergence linking the various contrasting and corresponding figure perspective. Example, the authorly intended reception perspective must be imagined in the receiver themselves. Thus, inherent in the structural distinction, there is also an implicit functional one. Direct didaxis gives way to an indirect of mediation which engages the receiver in the process of discovering the truth and in constituting the intended reception perspective. The shifting perspective enables the receiver to see the problem from different angles and thus to create a complex, multidimensional image of it. In fact, this step may be divided into two subtypes depending on the level of explicitness. The first refers to dramas in which is the intended reception perspective and articulated in the text itself in the form of one of the figure perspective and which must be recognized by the audience as such. Example of these are Twelfth Night and the comedies of Molière. They contain a rational figure like Tartuffe, for example. The second refers to the sort of plays that lead the audience to reconstruct the intended reception perspective for itself from the spectrum of contrasted of similar figure perspectives. Last is about open perspective structure. The relation between the figure perspective remain unclear, either because all control signals are omitted or because those that are not contradict one another. The intended reception perspective thus remains certain or ambivalent. The absence of any program solution is therefore complete. In this context, it might also be possible to apply in Gordon and Iser's notion of blanks to the theory of drama. Between the schematized viewpoint by Roman and Gordon, blanks are created and these open up scope for interpretation of the way in which it is possible to relate the aspect. Imagine, in the perspective to one another, faced with a complex and contradictory pattern of figure perspective and a number of inadequate or ambiguously coded control signals, the audience does not feel in a position to integrate the individual figure perspective into an unified reception perspective. To conclude, it is possible to arrange the perspectival types that have been discussed in this section according to extent to which they omit all already made solutions and the level of polyperspectivity. The following matrix therefore represents a summary of the way mono and or polyperspectivity is distributed in internal and external communication system. I think it's enough from me, and the material will be explained by my friend.
Epic Communication Structures in Drama by Nurul Izzah. Part 3.6.1 Epic Tendencies in Drama. Bertolt Brecht's design for an anti-Aristotelian epic theater, and this has led to a sharper awareness of epic tendencies in all kinds of dramatic texts, from classical antiquity to naturalism. The existence of diverging concepts of what the term epic actually means. Thus, before applying ourselves to an analysis of epic communication structures, we should like to summarize the three most important features that are associated with the concept of epic in drama. The ambiguity of this term can be explained by examining its historical development for since Plato and Aristotle. The contrast between epic and dramatic has been defined from a number of differing aspects and points of view. Part 3.6.1.1 The Abolition of Finality. According to Goethe and Schiller in 1797, the epic quality of a work rests in independence of its parts, and its dramatic quality in its finality, for example, the degree to which these parts focus on the ending. According to this view, an epic drama is one whose individual scenes remain relatively independent of each other. That is, the individual scenes and the relationship linking them with each other are more important than the relationship between them and the ending. The emphasis on the process-oriented suspense in epic theater is also linking up with Goethe and Schiller's theoretical reflections on the genre. This aspect is undoubtedly part of Brecht's concept of epic theater. According to this definition, epic theater is characterized by an episodic structure in which the individual scenes are sharply contrasted with each other. Part 3.6.1.2 The Abolition of Concentration. A second definition by Hegel contrasts the breadth and the plethora of detail of the epic film with the concentrate forms associated with the dramatic. Seen from this perspective, the epic tendency in drama may be described as the attempt to present reality on stage in its totality, together with all its minutiae details. A drama that is epic in this sense is to be understood as a detailed picture of reality, the totality of which can be presented either intensively in the form of representative segment of it, or expansively by introducing panoramic structure of time and place and having a comprehensive range of figures. The function of this epic tendency is to clarify the psychological and, in particular, social causal connections. It is also intended as medium for a critical appraisal of the concrete social and institutional structure that impede human development. Part 3.6.1.3 The Abolition of Dramatic Autonomy. The third definition of the contrast between epic and dramatic is based on the speech criterion, the contrast between report and representation, that was formulated by Plato and Aristotle. Within the framework of our dramatic communication model, we describe the speech criteria as the presence of a mediating communication system in narrative text and its absence in dramatic text. In contrast to normative theories of genre, we should like to regard this definition as heuristic rather than a normative model. Part 3.6.2 Technique use of epic communication. Brach acknowledged in his essay on the literature of the theater notes to the Tiffany opera. But whenever one comes across materialism, epic forms arise in the drama, and the most markedly and frequently in comedy, whose tone is always lower and more materialistic. From our survey of the three most fundamental types of epic tendency in drama, it is clear that only the last one is relevant to our present discussion of the epic communication structure in drama. The other two definitions will be examined more closely later on within the structural context of the plot, time, and space. Our next step, then, is to isolate and categorize the various structure and techniques of epic communication in drama. It should also be noted that the role of epic tendency varies according to the dramatic genre involved, and that there is a particularly strong affinity between epic communication structures and comedy. Part 3.6.2.1 The author as epic narrator. It seems appropriate to construct our classification according to the various layers of text in which the expressive subject of the epic commentary is situated. An important element within the most external layer of text is the so-called authorial secondary text. This should be mentioned because, especially in more recent dramas, it has been considerably expanded to include descriptive and commentative elements which often cannot be completely transposed into the stage enhancement. We can also see the example on the PowerPoint from Chekhov's Cherry or Card, and also from the dramatic review, which the title is Oh What a Lovely War in 1963 by Joan Littlewood's Theatre Workshop, as the entire cast sings the closing song dealing with the way the war is transfigured by the memory, and the title And When They Ask Us and Oh It's a Lovely War, like in the PowerPoint. And also an oversized projection screen shows the pictures such as 5 Tommies trying to pull a field gun out of the mud, or 2 very British officers, both in better dress, one with bandaged head. Parts 3.6.2.2 The introduction of epic elements by figures outside the action. Now we can turn to the epic communication structure that are present by the figures on stage. It is possible to divide these into two subtypes, depending on whether the figures appear in the mediating communication system alone or whether they appear in this and the internal communication system. For example, this view of Cour's role was defended by Schiller in the treatise on the use of lictors in tragedy with reference to the Bridge of Messina. So, using these informative narratives and evaluative commentaries to remain in constant contact with the audience, he is able to develop an independent figure perspective that is superordinate to and embrace those of all the figures on the internal dramatic layers. The superordinate perspective is demonstrated by the fact that he possesses far more information than the figures of his play. This enables him to disrupt the level of information in internal communication system at any time to pre-attempt future events. Parts 3.6.2.3 The introduction of epic elements by figures inside the action. Now we can turn to the structure of epic communication, in which a mediating communication system is created by figures situated inside rather than outside the dramatic action. This kind of personal union of dramatic figure and epic mediator can occur in prologue or epilogue as well as in the course and in commentaries by individual figures. As we can see the example in the PowerPoint, prologue declaimed by one of the dramatic figures were already a feature of classical drama. For example, Mercury prologue in Plautus Aptrimton. However, one particularly interesting example is Prospero epilogue in Shakespeare's Tempest, whose ambivalent transition from dramatic immediacy to epic distance has provoked a broad spectrum of differing interpretation. Parts 3.6.2.5 The repertoire of epic techniques. Epic communication structure undermines concepts of drama that perceive its absolute autonomy with regard to author and audience. Taken as whole, it represents the repertoire of formal epic techniques applied to the communication process. This repertoire is open and may be expanded at any time by the addition of newly developed presentation methods. Our description of this repertoire cannot even claim to be comprehensive as far as existing texts are concerned.
Hello, I'm Wulan Febrianti. I want to explain the material about successiveness and the transmission of the information. Happy listening! The transmission of information and the communication structures of dramatic text have tended to ignore the fact that a dramatic text is a process. For it is a truism that a dramatic text releases its information potential successfully in a strictly regulated pattern of successive elements. Time is therefore one of its prerequisite operational dimensions. The transmission of information in dramatic text has two temporal axes. The axis of simultaneity, whereby at any one time pieces of information are transmitted through the various codes and channels simultaneously, and the axis of successiveness, whereby pieces of information are transmitted accumulatively, one after another through the various codes and channels. We should now like to concrete on two elements that are particularly prominent in the chronological dramatic process, and in which successive aspect of information transmission is particularly significant, namely the exposition and the document. What we understand as the transmission of information at the beginning of a play largely coincides with the classical theoretical concept of the exposition, one of the most intensively analyzed formal aspects of drama. If, however, we define exposition as the transmission of information to do with the events and situations from the past that determine the dramatic present, then it becomes immediately clear that, on the one hand, exposition is not restricted to the introductory phases of the text, and on the other, the transmission of information in the initial phase of the text is not necessarily confined to serving some sort of expository function. It is therefore advisable to distinguish between the exposition proper and the dramatic introduction, or what E.T. described metaphorically as the dramatic upbeat. The equation of exposition and dramatic introduction demanded by normative dramatic theory can only be applied to a historically extremely limited type of drama. The underlying notion behind this kind of equation is particular interpretation of exposition based not on the criterion of information transmission but on rhetorical tradition that divide the text clearly into strictly separate practice orationis. However, any interpretation based on the criterion of information transmission must regard this as a special case that simply cannot be generalized into an absolute rule in a systematic theory of drama. A more successful way of classifying this special case is to locate it in a typological spectrum of exposition forms that is derived from the position of the expository information in the text as a whole. The sort of exposition we have just been talking about would occupy a position at one end of this typological spectrum. That is, when all of the information on the events leading up to the opening scene is transmitted in a clearly defined block at the beginning of the play. The criteria governing this type therefore require that information is transmitted in the initial position, in isolation, and clustered together in a block. The anagnorisis or recognition that Aristotle described in his Poetics is another way of transmitting expository information in the final phases of the text, insofar as the recognition refers to facts that condition the opening dramatic situation and that are new, at least in part, to both the figures and the audience. Another way of classifying the types of exposition is to establish the context in which the expository information is embedded. In doing so, it is particularly important to establish the dominant form of temporal reference. Whenever reference to the past predominates, the expository information dominates the context and the dramatic present remains subordinate to it. This dominance is most strongly evident whenever the expository information remains completely unmotivated on the internal dramatic level, as for example, when it is mediated explicitly in the prologue by a figure situated outside the action. A third approach toward classifying the types of exposition involved is to establish whether the expository information is mediated monologically or dialogically, and also how the speaker positions are occupied. Thus, in the case of monological exposition, the speaker can be a figure from either outside or inside the action. The first of these would imply the epic transmission of the expository information, of which the best known form is the expository prologue spoken by prologue figure located outside the action. It is important to distinguish between this purely epic form of exposition in the monological prologue. On the other hand, expository information conveyed in soliloquy delivered within the functional action. An example of this is the famous opening by the central character in Shakespeare's Richard III. In analogy with the theory of exposition that is applied to the beginnings of dramas, classical theorists also developed a number of concepts to help classify the endings. The relation of these concepts to one another can scarcely be said to be unambiguous or unified in any way, despite the fact that in the 18th century a distinction was made between duet and construct, which defined the former as the final peripetia and resolution of the intrigue, and the latter as the situation reached as a result. This situation then culminates in either a happy or a tragic ending after additional information has been introduced, such as new perspective on the event leading up to the play or a sudden change in the plot itself. When this happens, the structure of disparate awareness also generally changes, insofar as the informational difference between the dramatic features and thus between the features and the audience are reduced to a minimum or abolished altogether. We should like to call this type, which is the norm in classical theories of drama, the closed form of dramatic endings. In its pure forms, the closed dramatic ending is clearly marked by the resolution of all open questions and conflict and the abolition of informational discrepancy. As a reaction against the closed form of dramatic endings, playwrights have developed the open form. This is especially common in plays of the modern period. The deviation from the classical norm, marked by a refusal to supply an ending in which all the informational discrepancies are eliminated and all the conflict resolved, can have a number of different functions. The open-endedness of this play refers exclusive to the thematic aspect of the conflict of norms. There are, however, other texts, particularly of the modern period, in which the author does not resolve even the most basic factual question. In this discussion of the various ways the information can be sent successfully, we should also like to examine the whole question of dramatic suspense. By doing so, we would hope to establish a greater degree of precision and practicability in the ways this concept is applied, so as to undermine the tendency to equate suspense with some form of conflict or future-oriented finality. It is important to make it clear from the outset that within the framework of the present study, we do not intend to regard suspense primarily as a category of the reception process within the external communication system, but as a relation within the text and as the suspense potential of the text itself. Thus, the suspense in the receiver increases with the degree of his or her individual identificatory involvement in features and or situation, and decreases with the degree to which he or she is restricted by disruptive elements on both the internal and external dramatic level. As an element in the linear sequential development of the plot, suspense potential can only be present when the features on stage and the spectator in the auditorium are only partly aware of what may happen next. Suspense potential cannot occur if the features or spectator are completely aware of ensuing plot sequences, a situation that probably seldom arises, nor if the functional future is left completely open and unpredictable. The suspense always depends on the existence of an element of tension between complete unawareness on the one hand and a certain level of anticipatory expectation based on certain given information on the other. In the first case, there would be no problem question as to the future events. In establishing that the suspense potential of a dramatic text results from the particular awareness of the features or reserve as to what will happen next, we have done more than paraphrase the general condition applying to the build of suspense potential. At the same time, we have not yet explained on which factors the incentive of the suspense potential depends. We must therefore give some indication of the parameters that condition the intensity of the suspense. One factor that directly influences suspense is the extent that the receiver can identify with the fictional protagonist of the ensuing plot sequences. The stronger the identification, the more committed the audience becomes in the way they follow the plans made and the decision and risks taken by the fictional protagonist, and the more he or she will look forward with anticipation to the ensuing plot sequences. The degree of identification and empathy is not left to the audience entirely, but it also determined by the text itself. An additional significant parameter on which the intensity of the suspense potential depends is the informational value of the ensuing plot sequence. In theory, the informational value of an event decreases if the probability of its occurring increases. Conversely, it is true that the less probability there is of an event taking place, the higher its informational value will be. There is an event predicted, the anticipatory hypothesis of the future, or the receive on the basis of certain given information has a suspend potential that stands in inverse proportion to the probability of it actually taking place. Up to now, we have confined our discussion to the parameters that determine the intensity of one particular arc of suspense. However, the suspense potential that exists at a particular point in a dramatic text is generally the result of the interplay of several arcs of suspense. This can vary in length. Long-term suspense, which is often a feature of class drama, arches over the structure of the whole text, where short-term suspense merely embraces shorter plot sequences on an individual basis. In turn, these are intensified by the overall long-term suspense. Thus, suspense potential is not simply the sum of the incidence of long and short-term suspense, since each complements the other. At the same time, in the texts that do not contain this mutual complementation, the suspense potential at any given point will always be less, and the overall suspense potential will be calculated simply as the sum of the incidence of short-term suspense. In dramas with close ending, the suspense potential will finally completely disappear at the end, following the resolution of all the problems and conflict. In view of the large number of parameters involved and the problems involved in trying to quantify them, there would appear to be little point in attempting to measure the intensity of suspense potential. If one is to assume that the whole point of a scientific analysis of suspense is to explain and reflect accurately the perception experience, then this approach is completely invalid by the result it comes up with. Maybe that's it. Back to moderator.
Okay, that's all from our group. We apologize if any mistake. Thank you so much for watching and goodbye. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.